Welcome everyone to the webinar, Not Just Diverse but Inclusive, Prioritizing Publishers of Color. Allison?
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Maurer. I'm a librarian at the U of U's Marriott Library, and I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Mikey Valenzuela. Mikey and I worked together this past spring semester at the U of U as part of the MUSE, which stands for My U Signature Experience internship program. We at the library wanted to establish an internship that focused on collection development and anti-racism by bringing attention to the publishers that we order from and support, instead of simply looking at subjects and titles, which are important. But basically, we wanted to expand the list of publishers of color that we ordered from. And we also wanted to gain a better understanding of the publishers out there that we may have been missing, over the decades, over the years. So Mikey had a stellar application, of course, and got the job, and their work definitely matched their stellar resume. Plus, Mikey, as a junior studying philosophy, has considered library science as a possible graduate degree, which we wanted to encourage and hope to continue to encourage. Mikey has so many interests, but social justice and representation in libraries is up there. They also hosted the EDI pre-conference the ALA provides that was held at ULA this year. So I thought that was really great and exciting. The work that today's training will highlight is actually part of a year's worth of learning and training put on by both the Utah Library Association and the State Library. You can find out more at the State Library's main training page and on ULA's event website. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Mikey, who will talk about prioritizing publishers of color when developing your library's collection.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that amazing introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. The first thing you'll notice is that the title is a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we begin, I'd like to start off with a local land acknowledgement. Salt Lake City occupies and operates on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Shoshone, Ute, and Goshute peoples. The area colonially referred to as the state of Utah includes the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Shoshone, Ute, Goshute, Paiute, Navajo, and Dene peoples. The specific tribes of this land include the Confederate tribes of the Goshute, the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute tribe, the Cedar Band of Paiutes, the Shivwits Band of Paiutes, the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation, the Skull Valley Band of Goshute Indian tribe, the White Mesa Ute Mountain Community, and the Navajo Nation. I'd also like to take just a quick small moment of silence, as it is the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, as a remembrance of George Floyd and those who have been murdered by police over the last year and a half or even longer. So let's just take a quick 15 seconds as a moment of silence for those lost lives. Thank you so much for sharing that moment of silence with me. So in an effort to create an open and transparent space, I want to kind of further flesh out my background. I am a first-generation Egyptian American and fourth-generation German American. And by adoption, I'm second generation Mexican American, but I was raised predominantly in a white and German culture. I'm also queer and identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming. The great thing about the LGBTQIA+ community is that it's very fluid. And there's plenty of room to explore your identity as you want to. But for me, this means, as you may have noticed when Allison introduced me, that I use the pronouns they, them. I want to acknowledge that I do pass as white and straight, seeing that my partner is currently male. I feel like I pass as cisgender, but either way, I want to acknowledge that I still have the privilege that comes with that. That being said, my experiences are largely of someone from that background and that perspective. As far as the title of the presentation, it was originally not just diverse, but inclusive, prioritizing publishers of color. I want to note that technically, the term inclusion is usually well-meaning, but I realize now that it carries the idea that we're bringing people into the structure rather than working to change the structure itself. We can include everyone, but that doesn't mean we're working to change the structures of power themselves that made exclusion an issue in the first place. I think this is especially relevant for what we're trying to achieve through projects like this, because we're not just looking for books from diverse voices, but we're looking to support a different system where people of color are also on the power structure. Angela Davis put it really well when she said, "What's meant by diversity and inclusion isn't enough, as it only brings Black people into racist institutions without rooting out the structural racism. Diversity and inclusion can only be meaningful when it is connected with transformation. Institutions as a whole need to transform." And that was one of the reasons that I think it's important to note that rather than including authors of color and including publishers of color, by bringing publishers of color into our libraries and into our institutions, we're working to change those structures of power that made exclusion a point in the first place. I'll talk a little bit about the internship because that was a huge part of where this research came from. Through the Muse internship so far, we've ordered over 180, I think it might be up to 200 now, last I checked, books from everyone, or we've ordered over 180 books from authors or even editors in terms of anthologies that are people of color. We purchased from over 20 publishers run and or owned by people of color from a wide range of demographics. These include Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Middle Eastern, the Jewish community. I feel like there's another one I'm forgetting. Oh, Asian and Pacific Islander, I apologize. Among others, some of the publishers we've ordered from also are queer or trans, from the queer trans community. Sorry, there's a fly in my face. 4 of these publishers were located out of the United States, in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Canada, and though the internship was mostly focused on US companies, and we'll talk about why later. These are some of the books that we were able to purchase through this internship. And apart from the criteria of the publishing company being owned or currently headed by a person of color, and any books being written by people of color, we also adhere to specific audience and genre guidelines because of the limitations of our grant and the focus that the funders wanted to focus on. Sometimes we swayed, as a lot of publishers put out books we saw as filling a need in the library. In my initial research, I focused on academic titles, then widened the net to include literature, culturally important titles, as well as even children's books. And some of the books here, the one on the upper right, The Neighbors, was actually helped set the stage for today's struggle for democracy in Iran. The one below, A Bit of Thin Air, was the first time in a very long time someone had been sent to jail for morality or indecency in Egypt. And it was because there were nude art this cartoonist put out in a newspaper, and it was reported and they were arrested for indecency, but later released. And I thought that was incredibly interesting. This is also a bilingual book, so it is in both Arabic and English and includes the original illustrations. Like I mentioned, we also got a sprinkling of children's books. While that wasn't originally part of the criteria, we saw this as an important need in the library, especially picturing people of color on the front of children's books. We saw this as a gap in our literature. A large part of this research was first figuring out what we were looking for. The first thing I want to encourage you to do, because there are a lot of publishers out there, is choose the values that you want to shape your search around. And this will really help you focus in on what you're looking for. When I started out, there were clear requirements and guidelines, and those really shaped the values that I used. So this is an example of how I narrowed my search. The number one thing for me was that the company was owned and run by people of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Jewish. As I mentioned earlier, I had specific guidelines that I wanted to include all of the demographics that were on my list. And since you're all here, I'm going to assume that's your number one as well, is publishers owned by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. While publishers that publish people of color or support these authors are also important, they don't really align with the idea of breaking down and redefining systems of power. So especially when you're thinking of ordering and looking into books that are written by authors of color, I really encourage you to take it one step further so that we can redefine those systems of power. The lower values for me were the genre constraints we originally used based on the grant requirements. And below that is that they were US based. I really wanted to support local and beyond, especially with the racist histories of libraries in America. And if you don't know a lot about that, I encourage you to look it up and research it. And again, you don't have to stick to these 100%, these initial values that you put down, but they will help propel your search in the direction you want. So actually, I'm going to encourage all of you right now, just because we will be doing some activities during this workshop, to write down at least 2 values that you want to put below your publishers owned by BIPOC. So that could be that they are also queer publishers, that they are also women. It could be genres, it could be location-based or readership level. So however you want to put those down, I want to encourage you, and you can even put it in the chat, what your lower values are going to be. Really have it work like a funnel. So your most important to your, I guess not least important, but kind of an and then criteria rather than a or criteria. So even if you want to add that to the chat, if you want to write down, I would encourage you to please share the values that you'll be searching for today. You can even unmute yourself if you prefer that as well, to at least give a value that'll go below your publishers owned by. Awesome. I see popular reading titles. That's great. That's actually a huge one, especially with some of the newer publishers that are coming out. That'll be really easy to fill your search criteria with. And as you're thinking of these, I promise you publishers will prop up that may not fit these criteria, and that's fine as long as it's fine with you. And hopefully that makes sense, the whole funnel down idea for the criteria. History of Asian Americans in internment camps. I love that. And there's not a whole slide for this because it has way more to do with authors of color. But I think it's really, really important to focus on when we're hearing stories from these groups that we are, or when we're talking about groups like this, like Asian Americans and internment camps, that we're reading and purchasing stories from Asian Americans. So I love, love, love that somebody put that down. Thank you. Feel free to continue to add that to the chat. And we're going to cover quite a few strategies today. Age range reading level. I like that too. That's a good one. Okay. So once you have your values down, like I said, continue to put that on. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. These are all strategies I've been using, and we'll go over them one by one. Parts of this may be a quick exploration of the internet, and sometimes it can be a bit hard to keep track of. But if you need me to slow down at any point, or you need to go back and show you how I got where I did, just let me know. If you're a fan of rabbit holes, some of these strategies you will like more than others. We'll go over search engines, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, your classic Google to get something, as well as the keywords or structures of keywords that I found most successful so far. We'll talk about genre-specific searching. This works especially well if you had a readership level or genre as one of your search values. I'm looking at children's audience, age range, history, Asian Americans, all you guys. We'll also do group affiliation searches and a good old cursory list search from Goodreads. My favorite strategy is honestly the book backwards strategy, which we'll go over. And I don't know if that's a term yet. That's just the term I use because it's fun to say. Oh, the last one we'll touch on is social media and following some really cool groups and resources that are doing awesome work. Okay, so the first one is the good old Google grinding, or whatever search engine you prefer. I know some people don't like to be tracked, that's fine. You can also do this in your library databases or any ordering databases you use. But I found that Google really helps with getting the general cursory search out of the way, especially if you don't have a lot of BIPOC publishers on your list already. Excuse me. And lists are the most common result you'll come up with. Lists from blogs, news articles, Twitter posts, websites, etc. And if you've done any cursory searches like Black-owned publishers or publishing companies owned by Indigenous peoples or any cursory searches like that, I'm sure you've come up with plenty of lists, and you'll start to realize they kind of all start to look very, very similar. You may also come across things like small presses owned by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which is a link that you will receive in your handout after the webinar. But you also may come across lists like publishers that champion writing by people of color, which is less of what we want. All these lists, though, no matter what keywords you end up using, really do still need to be vetted, which we will also go over. I've gone through so many lists, and I promise you there is always a publisher on there, almost always. I feel like I would say there's always a publisher on there that is not a person of color, that may promote books by people of color, but is not a person of color themselves and wasn't properly vetted. Sometimes we make mistakes though, and that's okay. And we will talk about that when we get into vetting. In the meantime, I thought it might be fun to see what keywords we all come up with. My favorites lately are a mix of, and you'll see it in the lower left and the upper right, publishing, and then in quotations founded by, and then you insert the group in quotations. You insert whatever group you're looking for, or publisher owned by, and you insert whatever group you're looking for. These seem to come up with a lot of news articles featuring lesser known publishers or lesser known publishing movements or groups, rather than your endless blog lists. You'll start to notice on the race-based list, like I said, there's a lot of the same. But with these other keyword searches, you may start to find groups that aren't getting as much attention or as much support. So if anyone has any other keywords they really like, I really like to foster community. And if there are other suggestions that you found useful, feel free to post those in the chat. I don't really like to look for keywords like diverse books or I don't know, it just brings up a lot of authors of color rather than publishers of color. And that's it gets to be long. It's like finding a needle in a haystack after that. So anything like diverse spines or diverse books, I do like those keywords just for other things. Like the book backwards method, which we'll talk about. I love it. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if there's any like keywords you really, really like, feel free to post those in the chat. I'll try and add my favorite keywords. Like I mentioned, those two are the most successful that I've used so far. But those will be on the handout that you receive later. Going through publishers by list of genre. Going through lists of publishers may be extensive work, but you can find numerous publishers this way. This strategy is especially useful if you're looking for a specific genre, but less useful for the publishers who print a diverse catalog of books. Lists found this way have been some of the longest I've come across, but also some of the most unique and fruitful. So pulling this back up, I'm actually going to take us to one of those lists. And if this is old news to you, this is old news to you. But I really like, these are long. These are really long. And I'm not going to lie to you. It's extensive and I haven't been through all of them. So if you're looking for our books, and Kaya Press is actually somebody we just highlighted in our LibGuide, and I'm so happy they're the featured publisher. But if you're looking for, and stop me if for whatever reason you can't see the page, I just opened up a publisher directory list. Let me know if for whatever reason that didn't work and you can't see it. No one says anything, I'm gonna assume that it worked.
You can see it. Looks
okay,
good.
Awesome. So this is a really, really long list, and I'm not gonna lie to you, there is very little knowledge on which of these publishers are people of color. So if we just click on a random one, it may or may not tell you. But there's no list that says which publishers are owned by who, etc., that's easy to find. And I hope Allison isn't mad at me for this, which I don't think she will be, but when I went across this list, I literally went through and just picked a random one and then did a vet and honestly just tried to figure out if they were a publisher of color. This is extensive and eventually I want to be going through all of these. I'm planning on doing a directory that I'm working on right now. But if like you want to take a chance and you want to pick a wild card, just pick a random publisher or go through by alphabetical order, which I did try to do at one point. And this is just one of these many lists. So let's see. Who's on here? I mean, Kaya Press is on here, so you know there's at least one. And I put, I guess I put 4 examples. Some of you may be a bit familiar with this. It's an academic book publishers list from publishersarchive.com. And again, you're going to have to vet these, but this is a good way to go if you're looking for genre specific. And honestly, I just keep going until I find a publisher of color. And again, we'll go through strategies for vetting, and I mean, some of these like Cambridge University Press, like I'm obviously not going to click on that. But these lists are great and I can include them or just do a cursory Google search for lists. And this was a huge strategy that I used. The Nonconformist magazine has a great list. And again, these are not all vetted. I cannot tell you right now which of this list, if it'll load, are publishers of color and which are not all the way through. I hope this loads. There we go. So this is indie publishers and small presses. And again, it's long and there's like some, but they don't tell you. They rarely tell you. It's a long list. But again, if you're looking for indie publishers or less supported publishers, this is the list to be looking for your publishers of color. And the last one, and I really like this one just because of my affiliation with the queer community. But this is LGBT plus GWS and feminist publishers. And they don't always coincide. Feminist Press of CUNY is CUNY is definitely diverse. They have a diverse group, but where the money goes, and again, that's up to your values. Like if you really want to make sure your money is going to straight to people of color, then you pick your publishers with those values in mind. This is really interesting. Core Press, we didn't end up including just because, like I said, I wasn't sure. I don't know where the money goes. And if I can't tell, I went through hundreds and hundreds of publishers. So if I can't tell right away, then I usually put it on my come back to list, which is also fine. But they specifically say promotes works by diversity of women, including those traditionally underrepresented in the cultural mainstream. And that is kind of a red flag to me, just because we're looking for publishers or publishers that are owned by people of color. And when they say support, I mean that yes, but also it kind of makes me not wonder, like, that's great, I'm glad they're supporting, but not really the top of my value list at the time I was researching. So while Core Press is awesome and their books are awesome, it was not on the top of my value list for that reason. Anyway, so long lists, great for genre, great if you're looking to support a specific group, but extensive. If you're familiar with a lot of publishers' names, maybe not as extensive, maybe you can just go through and find what publishers you're not familiar with, and that's awesome. But just be aware they are very long. Okay, you can also go by groups and affiliations. And actually owe Allison for this, the search of Indigenous and Tribal College presses. There are 32 accredited tribal colleges in the US right now, and there's even more in Canada and beyond. Listed, but 32 are listed on the Department of Education website. And I basically did the same thing that I did with those long lists. I went through and searched the college's websites for any traces of a press they might have had. And the ones that we did find are listed on our LibGuide, and I will be sharing that link again at the very end of the presentation. But oh, ignore that. Ignore the fourth point. I apologize. But there were only, I think there were only two: Sinte Gluska University, which is also written as SGU University. And then there was also Dene College Press, which was formerly Navajo Community College Press. And they're currently on hold, but working to build up the funding to start up their press again. So I actually really encourage you to go support Dene College Press any way you can, ordering some of their books that are older, or following them to see when they start publishing again. I'm actually really excited for them. And I've gone through most of this list, but the one thing I didn't do, I just did website searches. I didn't contact these colleges directly, and that's one of the next steps that I'll do. If that is one of your, if you really want to support Indigenous and tribal colleges, I would encourage you to do that yourself. Or if there's a local Indigenous and tribal college that's closest to you, or that maybe you have an affiliation with, I would encourage you to contact them and see if they are publishing books, even books published by students. The book on the left is actually from Tribal College Press, which I would also encourage you to go support. They do a lot of works by students and around tribal colleges. This one is actually a history on, it's a poetic history, I guess you could say, on tribal colleges in the US. Another one you could go look at if you're looking to support through groups and affiliations is Historically Black Colleges and Universities, which also the description below that is wrong. I apologize. So just don't pay attention to that description. And there are lists of historically Black colleges and universities all over the web, and I would encourage you to do the same exact thing. Oh yeah, no, it was a template. Thanks, Daniel. It was the template before. I apologize. I encourage you to do the same thing, look up through lists and support the books and presses that are run by historically Black colleges and universities. The last one is the AACP, and this is the Asian American Curriculum Project. And they put out huge lists, they're nonprofit. I really encourage you to check them out. They're just really cool. I mean, they updated this in 2020, even though it looks older. So like they're still putting stuff out, they're still up and running. You can even do like a browsing, and I think you can order from them directly. I can't remember right now, but I feel like you can. They have subjects, but I really encourage you to go support them. And of course, there's more. I feel like the LGBTQ task force, do they publish still? Anyway, these are the ones that I currently have research on. Okay, so as far as social media and supporting specific groups go, this is just a quick highlight of some of the groups that I've been following on social media and following their blogs. No Name Book Club is really cool, and if you are not a person of color, I would encourage you to leave this space for people of color, but they do have some great book lists online that may be published by publishers that you do not currently have in your library. You can also follow People of Color in Publishing, which is POCPUB on Instagram, and they do some amazing highlights of people who are currently working in publishing that are people of color. They also keep the community kind of updated on, I don't want to say scandals, mishaps, unfortunate events, publishers that say they support people of color, but then do something contrary to that mission. Anyway, there's also Latinx in Publishing, which is a great group, and I've gotten amazing suggestions from. They mostly highlight books, but they also have a blog that's really cool where they highlight people from the Latinx community that are currently in publishing. Well Read Black Girl, if you haven't heard of her yet, she's awesome. Check her out. Again, there are Well Read Black Girl community book clubs across the nation, but if you are not part of the Black community, I would highly suggest you leave this space for the Black community, but definitely still consume her blog posts or suggestions. She actually published a book, and I think it's either in the front or the back. There's a list of like 20 plus or something like that other books by Black women. I think they're all by Black women, possibly Black women and men and non-conforming. I can't think of every book on the list right now, but she actually just published a book. So if you haven't seen or read, I think the book is self-titled. I think it's also Well-Read Black Girl is the title of the book. I would highly suggest you look into that. It's very cool. There's also the aalbc.com. The African American Literature Book Club, and they have tons of lists. They have, this is probably one of the only times their list on Black publishers of color is probably one of the only times I would say you know that all of the publishers on that list are of the Black community. Other lists I question, but I trust the list that they have put out, the AALBC. They also do a lot of like book suggestions and other stuff. The only thing I will say is that some of their information is outdated. Some of those publishers are no longer owned by the Black community and have since been sold to other companies, or some of those publishers are no longer printing books. So I would maybe just double check that. There is also Well-Read Native, which is one I came across recently. And again, I encourage you to leave the communities themselves to the people that the communities are meant for. But Well-Read Native, the blog and the website do actually put out some really cool book lists. There's also Minorities in Publishing podcast and blog, and I'm actually going to go to their site really quick because they're pretty cool. And Jen Baker does a really cool, and she is a Black woman, but Jen Baker does a really cool podcast. And you can access that on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, but it is called Minorities in Publishing. So I'd really encourage you to go check that out. There's also a whole blog here where they do a lot of highlights of different people in publishing. So that's pretty cool. Like I mentioned before, the tribal colleges and historically Black colleges and universities. Tribal College Journal does a really great article called Best Native Books of 2019, Best Native Books of 2020. And they feature books that came out that year by Indigenous authors. And I really like and trust this list because one, Tribal College as a press and as a database and like a news source is just really cool all around. And also that I really trust when communities highlight authors from their own communities. And so I just really like their books that they feature. I'll show you that just really quick, just because it's really fun. I really like looking at book covers. These are some of the ones that were mentioned in 2020. And there's just a whole article you can check out. I am not sure I've looked into all the publishers of each of these books yet. But that is part of the method we'll go over. And honestly, just website combing, just comb their websites. If you don't immediately see mention of a press, like I said, comb their websites, contact them. I trust you all know how to research. Okay, so as far as Goodreads go, if you don't know what Goodreads is, it's okay. I just joined this last January. So I'm definitely behind the mark. You all probably have Goodreads accounts already. But none of the lists link to, none of these lists I'll link to that will be in your handout will be publisher specific. I'm still looking for something like that and building my own, but until then, there are some really great lists on here, and these are just a few. So these are not publishers of color, but these are authors of color. And you can use this strategy to you can use these strategies in the book backwards method that I'll mention. I know I keep mentioning it. I just really like it. If you don't know what Goodreads is, go check it out. It's chock full of lists. If you go to the search engine and just click Listopedia, I think is what it's called. And you can put in BAME, BIPOC, etc. And sometimes you can even find, like, there's this whole list of comic books by people of color. There's a whole list of children's books by people of color, biographies, etc., etc. And I've done quite a few of these. I will take us to one of them. And I've definitely found publishers this way. This is just someone's personal list that I liked. And you know, these are just people make mistakes. These may not all be publishers of color, but they usually are. It's rare that I found a couple on here that are or that are not authors of color. Sorry, there definitely are not going to be publishers of color on here, but there will be some. So I encourage you to look through these, to use our book backwards method, which we are finally to. I apologize, I've been working up to it. Okay, so book backwards method is basically the idea that BIPOC-owned publishers publish BIPOC authors. This works the same for queer-owned publishers, disabled publishers, etc. And yes, I said disabled. Let's not get into label preference. Oh, in an effort of transparency, I identify as a disabled person. So you won't be upset when I use that word. You can find the books using the techniques we've already talked about, or maybe you can come across them at a book club or fair or what have you. I really encourage you to look up and find fairs specifically supporting people of color. There's a lot of them out there, and a lot of them lately are virtual, which is really cool. So I encourage you to check that out. And this is really cool if you are one of those people that just like walk through bookstores. I'm definitely that person. Or if you follow any of the hashtags on Instagram that we talked about, diverse books, diverse publishers, people of color in publishing, Latinx in publishing, etc. If you follow any of those, they highlight a lot of books. So this is a great method if you kind of want a more passive way to find publishers of color. Passive-ish. Less passive than looking through hundreds of publishers on a list. You basically take the books by publishers you don't recognize and do a search. And you probably know how that goes. So as far as vetting publishers goes, I think this is one of the most important parts. And there are basically, once you get the hang of it, it's not hard. And I'm sure some of you have already done it before. You'll basically find your publisher, go to their website. If they don't have a website, I don't know, I'm apprehensive to reach out personally If they don't have a website, also you can use things like Wikipedia, any databases. I actually got a directory, and you can't see the cover because it's an interlibrary loan. But it's a directory of ethnic and multicultural publishers, distributors, and research organizations. These are not all people of color. Maybe you can. It's from 2003. It's from 2003. That was the last one they put out, though. And so you can find directories, Wikipedia. Again, you all probably know how to, I'm gonna assume you know how to research. But I think the most fruitful way I've vetted publishers is looking at their About Us, our mission, staff, or board. And you ask yourself the question, do any of these give you an idea of the people who own or run this company? And and if yes, you can look to the right, cool, are they people of color? What do they identify as? And this is a huge, huge thing, because I promise you, if they are a person of color and they want you to know, they will be transparent about it. Often keywords like diversity show up in websites a lot, or we support diversity, or we encourage diversity. This doesn't mean that they're owned by a person of color, that there are any people of color in their company. If they don't identify, Google them. Pictures, LinkedIn, Wikipedia, do they identify anywhere? Or, is it obvious they're not white? Well, then add them. How you judge this is up to you, and it's a great time to look internally at bias and also look at the values that you're looking to support in your search. Honestly, it's as simple as that. So if your answer to the first question is no, but their team is, so no, they're not a person of color, but it looks like someone on their team is, or someone on their staff is, or someone on their board is. What are their positions? And BIPOC in positions like marketing, design, and internships does not a diverse publisher make. And I kind of hate that I have to say this, but it's true. If you look at any stats of people of color in publishing, the most often filled positions are marketing, design, and like lower secretarial internship or administrative assistant positions. This does not make a diverse publisher. If they don't also have people high up, at least for me, that doesn't fit my search value. And then just look at, does this align with your search values? Because support is important, but dismantling systems of oppression is more important. And I know we don't have that much time left, but really quickly, I'll give I'll search one for you. Let's do that. I'll search one for you. I was going to have you do an activity and figure out who of these are diverse, would count as diverse publishers of color. So I'm going to do one first, Mazda Publishing. So, Mazda Publishing. And honestly, I think they say it on their Google page. About Us, word from the publisher. This is the publisher. Where does it say it? If it doesn't say it here, which I'm not sure it does, I'll look up the publisher specifically, which is A.K. Jabari. And eventually we would get to the point where it talks about, I think he's originally from, He's from somewhere. Anyway, eventually we would get to the point where we find that he is from, like I said, it's a rabbit hole. You just keep going. And I think it's just stressful to read while I'm on camera. Anyway, he immigrated from the Middle East, and I believe he started the company in like the 80s is what it says eventually. Anyway, publisher color. I probably should have used someone like Interlink because there's a ton of, okay. The other example I'm going to use is House of Anansi, and some of you may already be familiar with this publisher. I assumed at first that they were Black, because Anansi is a mythological or religious story from Africa. So I assumed, I think it's like the god of spiders, or it's not important. So I assumed they were people of color, but when you look at their About Us, I mean, you see a couple diverse faces, but when you go through and find was founded by Dennis Lee and David Godfrey, you eventually do a Google search and find out they're two white men from Canada. And that didn't align with the values that I put in my search, so I didn't choose them. So like I said, it's important to always vet your publishers all the way through. Sometimes it may be tough. I'll highlight two publishers we found really quick. Interlink Publishing, their publisher came to New York from Lebanon in 1984, and they still support bilingual and writers from all over the Middle East, including Lebanon, Egypt, Morocco, Palestine, Iran, Jordan, Syria, etc. They have two imprints, Olive Branch Press and Crocodile Books. If you're looking specifically for children's books, I really encourage you to check out Crocodile Books. They're awesome. I'll also highlight Cassava Republic, which is really cool. They support authors out of Nigeria and are based in Nigeria. This was one of the times where I moved past my top 3 values of being in the US, just because I thought the work they were doing was so cool. They focus really heavily on marketing their books well so that the books get spread throughout Nigeria and beyond. Their ownership is Bibi Bakari Yusuf. She's really cool. She does a whole video on YouTube, and you can actually see the video she does about the publishing on our LibGuide. This is my contact information and the link to the LibGuide. I'm also going to put it, and it'll be the on the sheet of links and resources you get. I'm just typing it in here. And it's kind of a living document. So it's being updated, and it's still being updated, and there's a list of publishers we found so far. The one thing I want to leave you with is, oh, and there's also my Twitter. Not that I'm on there often, but I've been on there more often. So if you want to follow me or future work that I am doing, or I may start highlighting publishers, feel free to follow me there. You can also email me at my U of U address. One thing I want to leave you with is that one, it's okay to make mistakes, as long as you're doing the work. If you have good intent and you're doing the work, make mistakes, and like, it's okay to admit that you've made mistakes. I originally found a publisher called Arte Publico Press, and because of their history and their videos, etc., I had assumed that they were owned by someone in the Latinx community. They're on the border of Texas. They put out bilingual works and tons of works by Latinx people on the border right there. It turns out that they are not. They are owned by a lovely couple that came from the easternish part of America and transplanted into Texas. And like, that's great, but they are two white people with white backgrounds, and while they may be fluent in Spanish, that wasn't part of the values. So we ended up taking them off our list, and like, that's okay. Feel free to make mistakes as you're doing this work. I think the important part is that you keep doing it and that you have good intention and good values. And I think it's, there's the trend that we're supporting so many authors of color. And while that's incredibly important, I think it's also important that we support the publishers of color. Where is the money going? How are the authors being treated? That we work to dismantle these positions of power that have been held for so long by predominantly white publishers. It's time that we expand our support for our publishers. And with that, honestly, I want to open it up to conversations and questions. If you have questions, if you have critiques of my methods, that's also fine. All of this research and work and all of the methods I used basically started from the ground up I think I started January of this year, and all of this has been a result of that. So I want to open up the floor to anyone who has questions, comments, something you want to ask specifically about. It's up to you.
This is Rita. I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you can. Do you feel like if you're an author of color that you're not going to be able to stay with a publisher of color to be a successful writer? Are you going to have to go to the big five?
Personally, not being a published author myself or having a lot of experience in that community, but I have read a lot of information on this, and I think that's why this push is so important, because even self-publishing has become incredibly popular, and I think while I can't say if they'll be successful or not, I think it's incredibly important that we support publishers other than the big five for those reasons, because like I said, we're working to dismantle these positions of power, and they're not going to find more success as authors of color from publishers of color until we spread and start supporting them. I hope that answered your question.
Right. No, it does. And I can see that, but I can see how some authors would be lured to leave maybe their original publishing house, to become Jason Reynolds or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I'm never going to say, no, you shouldn't do that, because whatever brings more people of color success is great. But at the same time, I don't know, maybe Allison, you have a lot more.
No, I think that it's a good response, and it's a really good question, Rita. I kind of wonder if an intermediary, like, reality or option is these big publishing houses and their imprints. And I wonder if there's more like editors, acquisition editors within the imprints that are people of color. So it's like maybe the big company is not owned by a person of color, but the imprint is, and then you're kind of leveraging that big corporate big five money for supporting authors of color, and then also supporting those acquisition editors going to find the stories and the content.
Yeah, there's actually HarperCollins right now, and I really like what HarperCollins is doing in this field right now. I I mean, if someone has something negative to say, definitely, but I haven't heard anything as of yet. But they have a new imprint called Amistad. I'll post it in the chat. And they're that is run by people of color. And again, that one is listed in our LibGuide, and we've ordered a couple books from them. But I think this is a great example of what Allison is talking about, leveraging the big five power. Yeah, I think imprints are great examples of leveraging that power, but also creating change.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have a question or comment?
I think I think this was just really eye-opening because I have tons of catalogs, and there are some that I thought it didn't occur to me that they were not most likely being run by people of color. I didn't even think about it. So this has been great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Yeah, Liz, I think that's a great point. Gray areas were really big in this, and Allison can attest to this. There were tons of times where we were looking at books and ordering books and thought, okay, but does this fit the specific value we want to be supporting? Because they looked like good books, but they were from publishers of color, but sometimes they weren't written by people of color. And so those values were really, really important. Yeah, I really like, following your own values is great, because at the end of the day, and those may change. Oh, you're good. You're good, Sharon. And your values may change, and that's okay. Like I said, we're all learning, and as long as you're doing the work and correcting your mistakes and correcting your course while you're looking things up, I'm going to save this link. Then I think that's great. Okay, if that's all, I know we went kind of fast, but like I said, you will be getting a link with the resources. Again, there's the LibGuide, and that will be updated. In the future, I do plan on putting out a directory. In what form that will be is still up for debate. But I want to thank you all for coming here today. If no one has any further questions.
I have a question. When I'm running a collection development meeting tomorrow, so when will we get the link to the resources or the PowerPoint?
You should get them sometime today.
Today. Okay. Thank you.
You are welcome. Yeah, thank you so much all for coming. Have an excellent rest of the day. I won't take up any more of your time.
Thanks, Mikey. That was really great.